Thanks very much. So welcome to everybody, and I'll hand the floor to Celine Kaufman to open the webinar.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and welcome to all participants. I can see indeed that there's many of you, including a number of delegates in the Committee on SME and Entrepreneurship. So it's a pleasure to see that so many of you. And I would also like to extend warm welcomes and thanks to our panelists and our moderator, Rodney Boyd from the British Business Bank, and the really great lineup of speakers that have agreed to share their perspectives and be with us today. Granville Martin from the IFRS Foundation, Christophe Ménigaud et Raphaël Cotin from BPI France, Alexia Femia from the European Banking Federation, and Heather Buchanan from the Bankers for Net Zero. All of you, really a pleasure to see you again and to welcome you on this webinar. This webinar is actually the first webinar of the OECD platform on financing SMEs for sustainability of the year. And it triggers with a topic that is really of great interest to our platform members, as well as more broadly to the CSME participants, as well as a great range. Sorry, I was a bit disturbed by this change in the format, as well as a great range of stakeholders in the SME sustainable finance ecosystem. Those of you who joined the roundtable that we hosted last December will recall that the challenge of bridging sustainability reporting gaps for SMEs and the need for a coordinated approach in terms of reporting requirements came through very strongly throughout the meeting as being one key area for definitely further efforts from all stakeholders. And in fact, there was even a very strong call for the OECD to catalyze dialogue and knowledge sharing, in particular through the SME Sustainable Finance platform on these important issues. So we are therefore very happy to host and to dedicate today's event to a discussion on this very critical and timely topic. So let me just very quickly, before I hand over the floor to Rodney, recap the issues at stake. First, we know that financial institutions face growing regulatory requirements to disclose the environmental and sustainability performance of their operations, as well as of their finance portfolios. And just to name, one of these new regulatory requirements, I would name the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation that started in the EU in 2021. And of course, this raises very important questions about the implications of these developments on SMEs' continued access to finance, particularly since SMEs do not have the same capacities or resources to measure and to report on their sustainability performance as their larger counterparts. But on top of that, and this is the second key trend, we also see a broadening of reporting requirements more generally for businesses on ESG. And again, here, let me mention the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU that just entered into force in January, and will actually extend the requirements to report to listed SMEs by more or less 2026, 2027, even though some of the SMEs will have the option to opt out for a further year. So I'm mentioning this obviously because these reporting requirements will need to be somehow aligned and coordinated. But third, beyond the regulatory requirements, SME sustainability data is also needed to enable financial institutions to design and implement sustainability financing instruments that are adapted to SMEs and can support their green transitions. Not only a regulatory requirement, it's a prerequisite for banks and financial institutions to better understand their clients and to tailor the instruments that they can extend to them. And of course, on the flip side, in the absence of relevant data, financial institutions may be increasingly reluctant to lend to SMEs, with the risk of cutting off their critical access to finance. But what we see on the ground, and this is the fourth major observation, is that most SMEs today do not measure their environmental or broader sustainability performance. And just to give an example, in the UK, only about 10% of SMEs currently measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and only 22% do not fully understand the term net zero. About 1/3 of SMEs have yet to seek advice or information to develop a net zero roadmap or improve their environmental performance. So we see a discrepancy here. And in this webinar, we want to explore the demands that the changing regulatory and reporting landscape are placing on financial institutions and SMEs, and how relevant actors, including standard setters, policymakers, generally speaking, regulators, public and private financial institutions, but also I would add NGOs and SMEs associations, can do to help and address the challenges posed by SMEs data and reporting gaps. But beyond that, beyond just highlighting the issues that SMEs are facing, what we'd like to discuss today is some of the solutions that can help SMEs. And in particular, maybe to discuss some of the points that are putting challenges to SMEs. In particular, how to account for the broad diversity of SMEs to better tailor the reporting requirements and request relevant data, because we all know that there's not such a thing as an average SME when collectively they account for 95% of business population, 60% of value added, and more or less, or between 40 and 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So what really matters in their risk profile when it comes to their size, their location, their sector, the firm attribute, anything else, and how to help SMEs understand critically the double materiality principle, not to overburden them with non-relevant information. How do you do that? Well, how do you understand what matters for the risk profile of SMEs when it is not necessarily the individual footprint that matters, but more the collective one? And so how do you reconcile this, individual with the collective risk that SMEs may raise? So, to help us maybe advance on this discussion, we are very pleased to have with us again a very distinguished panel of experts that will share their perspective on these critical questions. And personally, I look forward very much to that discussion. But before, I'll hand over the floor to the moderator, Ronnie Boyd, to introduce the speakers and get the discussion started. Many thanks, Ronnie. The floor is over to you.
Thank you, Celine. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, as Celine introduced, I'm Rodney Boyd. I'm a senior manager in the British Business Bank, where I lead on net zero and green finance, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the OECD, Miriam and Maria, for inviting me to chair this webinar. It's a series, as Celine mentioned, as part of the OECD platform on financing SMEs for sustainability, of which the BBB is a proud co-founding member. And we're very pleased to be joined by other members and knowledge partners today. So as Celine has set out very nicely, the panel can hopefully start to address some of these important questions on sustainability data of SMEs, and start to look at the gaps and how to overcome them during today. I guess if I may, let me introduce and speak for a few minutes on this topic more broadly and why it's important to us. Specifically, we want to dig into data related to SME finance providers and supply chain information, and what banks and other SME funders may need to prepare for as disclosure expectations and mandates become the norm in many countries. This is an area of the highest importance for the British Business Bank and many other like-minded institutions who provide finance and invest in SMEs around the world. Hence, we feel quite strongly that the OECD platform is in a unique position to host this level of discussion. I mean, from the bank's perspective, we support around, at the moment, around a third of the UK's SME population, which is around 1.8 million SMEs, largely driven by COVID recovery and response in the last few years, which will be very unsurprising for many of you to understand. And we do so by investing alongside and with private finance providers who act as our intermediary in many of these engagements. They themselves are very diverse and small businesses, and so it highlights the difficulty not only of institutions like us to gather information and measure and understand what data we have, but also that of the finance providers that we work through. And so as the British Business Bank, we will be taking steps to help support those finance providers if they're less able to, for instance, disclose or act on climate themselves. As Celine mentioned, at the same time, we want to not overburden the SMEs and yet understand how we can be part of this overall SME finance offer in the UK and ensure that no business is left behind in the transition. So this webinar comes at a very timely and critical moment in small business finance provision. Not least because our work in the UK estimated that SMEs account for around 50% of business emissions. And so the OECD's recent headline in its report from, I think it was a couple of years ago, says it's best there will be no net zero without SMEs. So therefore, we know the importance of supporting these SMEs to ensure that on top of their current focus areas, such as COVID or cost of living, they have the capacities also to understand and measure their own emissions and impact, and also disclose this to their upstream financiers and enterprises and supply chains. So ultimately, the questions that Celine has already highlighted are that how can we best support SMEs in this transition, identifying and overcoming at the same time these numerous market failures that they may face when they try and access finance. On the financing individual SME basis, what data is required to better understand that institutions like us, plus governments, regulators, private finance institutions, are impactful and successful? And at the same time, what data will larger companies up the supply chain need and how will they get it? So to answer these questions and some more as well, I'm joined today by 5 esteemed experts from 4 leading institutions. They will in turn present themselves, their role and responsibilities and perspectives in this challenge, and then we will open the floor to Q&A or questions from the audience. So please do send in comments via the chat function, and we will pick them up later. So firstly, let me introduce the panel. So bringing the international standards setting perspective, we have Granville Martin, who's the Director of Global Regulatory Outreach at the IFRS Foundation, where he leads engagement on American regulators, corporates, trade associations, bringing experience from law, corporate governance, and private ESG and sustainable finance. So welcome, Granville. Speaking from the point of view from an established public development bank for businesses, we're joined by 2 colleagues from BPI France, Christophe Ménégot, who's the head of corporate social responsibility, and Raphael Cotin, who's an economist. We're very pleased to have the BPI France join here today as a recent member of the OECD platform as of the end of last year. And Christophe is in charge of ESG regulatory monitoring reporting for BPI France, as well as responding to external financial rating agencies and interaction with Caisse de Dépôt. Raphael is an economist in the Evaluation, Economic and Prospective Studies Department, which sounds fascinating, and specializes in carbon accounting and environmental evaluation. Next is representing some 3,500 private banks and lenders from 33 national banking associations across Europe. We have Alexia Femia, who's a sustainable finance policy advisor at the European Banking Foundation, who are also a knowledge partner of the OECD platform. Alexia works on sustainable finance regulation, including sustainability reporting and interlinkages with SME access to finance. And lastly, I'm pleased to introduce Heather Buchanan, who's the CEO and co-founder of Bankers for Net Zero, an initiative that brings together banks, businesses, regulators to support the financial sector transition to net zero in the UK, also a knowledge partner of the OECD platform. So it's nice to meet you all. And I guess we'll kick off with Granville. The International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, sitting under the IFRS, is one of the main global standard setters of sustainability disclosure and a reference point for regulators globally. So what approaches can this ISSB help enable financial institutions to meet reporting requirements without imposing undue burdens on their SME clients? And can you share with us your perspective on forthcoming reporting requirements of financial institutions? The floor is yours, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Rodney, and greetings, good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever people happen to be. I'm speaking to you from Montreal, Quebec, where the ISSB just recently, last week, completed its most recent board meeting. And we can talk a little bit more about what was decided there. I think this audience is quite sophisticated and informed about sustainability disclosure, so I will skip the description of what the ISSB is and where we came from. In terms of process, the meeting that we had last week finalized the substantive decision-making by the board for the two proposed standards. S1, the general requirements standard, which requires the disclosure of all financially material sustainability risks and opportunities, and S2, the climate-related disclosures standard, which requires the disclosure of all financially material climate risks and has a whole range of additional disclosures. Let me talk a little bit more about the general requirements standard. S1 is the first time in the accounting literature that you see a requirement to disclose all material sustainability risks and opportunities. So it is a very significant requirement by itself. It's modeled on the International Accounting Standards 1 and IAS 8, IAS 1 and 8, uses the same materiality definition that is used with respect to the International Accounting Standards Board, which we think will promote efficiency and consistency for companies, including SMEs. It emphasizes the need for consistency and connections between financial statements and sustainability disclosures, which we believe allows companies and SMEs to focus through the lens of their business onto sustainability disclosure. S1 also requires that financial statements and sustainability disclosures be published at the same time, but it does not specify a location for disclosure and allows additional information to be provided. And I would imagine we'll talk a little bit more about this. This concept of allowing additional information is another way of saying that the aspects of double materiality that are being pursued and implemented within the European Union would be additional to the financially material disclosures that are required by the ISSB. And there are productive discussions with DG FSMA and EFRAG about alignment and interoperability. And I'm pleased to say that those discussions have been quite productive. So I think from the perspective of preparers, that there'll be more and positive news to talk about with respect to interoperability. With respect to S2, the climate-related disclosures, S2 is built on TCFD and the SASB standards, the industry-based standards. And the climate-related standard focuses on physical risk, transition risks, and climate-related opportunities. It requires climate resilience disclosure, which includes scenario analysis, and requires the disclosure of scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, including a financed emissions requirement for financial institutions. I know we have a lot of panelists, so let me just quickly conclude this part of my discussion with there are significant reliefs built into the ISSB standards, which we believe will assist companies and SMEs in particular to manage their disclosure burden effectively, and will allow them to start in a manner consistent with their own capabilities and skills, and then improve and expand their disclosure over time. We recognize that for many companies, particularly SMEs, sustainability disclosure is in its early days, and that there is a period of a safe environment where companies can put in place the thinking and the processes that will allow them to expand and improve their sustainability reporting over time. In other words, there's not an expectation that companies are going to immediately be able to provide what in the future would be considered by investors to be required information. So let me stop right there and hand it back to you, Rodney.
Thanks, Granville. If I could just quickly follow up before going to the next panelist. How you mentioned that clearly sustainable disclosures in its early days, especially not least just companies, but also SMEs. So how are you going to envisage bringing in that level of proportionality to the expectations? Would you mind spending another minute on that?
Yeah, certainly. The inclusion of SMEs in sustainability disclosure ultimately is a decision that regulators in a particular jurisdiction will have to make. We're a standard setter, not a regulator. However, because we've done extensive market outreach and consultation, we have realized, and we knew this going in, but it's been reiterated, that concern about reporting efficiency and burden on SMEs is really a global phenomenon. We're talking to a largely European audience this morning, but Canada, Japan, China, major emerging markets, South Africa, Nigeria, they have all raised similar observations about SMEs. And as a response to that, the board asked itself, what concepts can we use that will allow companies to manage their reporting burden? And there are some analogs or examples in the international accounting standards that were drawn upon. So I'll give you a couple of examples. If you one area where company capability has been raised is with respect to scenario analysis. Scenario analysis is required under the ISSB. Having said that, the scenario analysis disclosures that a company must undertake are, quote, must be based on reasonable and supportable information that is available without undue cost or effort. Now, that language, reasonable and supportable without undue cost or effort, was drawn directly from IFRS 9 and 17. Our expectation is that companies are going to be able to use that language to understand where they are in their own disclosure development, and be able to make disclosures with respect to, for example, scenario analysis. And we provide in one of our board papers a spectrum of what we think a scenario analysis disclosure would look like, starting from really narrative, qualitative disclosure, eventually moving to more quantitative numerically based disclosure in future years. And so this reasonable and supportable without undue cost or effort concept and language is applicable not just to scenario analysis, but to the determination of anticipated financial effects, the measurement of scope 3 emissions, the determination of the scope that a company should bring to assessing its value chain. And that's with respect to both scope 3 on the one hand, but also general sustainability risks and opportunities. I'm sure many people on the call are aware that some of the most material and important sustainability risks that companies confront are embedded in their value chain. Having said that, many companies let us, through feedback, underscored that at the beginning of their efforts, they are uncertain about how to assess their value chain exposure to risk. And as a result of that, we have provided this reasonable and supportable without undue cost or effort language to allow companies as they're getting started to take a more realistic view of their disclosures as they improve over time. In addition, the board has taken the decision to provide for the consideration of the company's skills, capabilities, and resources in the context of the determination of financial effects and with respect to climate-related scenario analysis. So again, this is another avenue for companies to assess their own readiness and disclose consistent with their own abilities. Finally, there are a range of areas where the ISSB will be providing additional guidance materials to allow companies to very efficiently and quickly identify areas where they ought to consider their own disclosures. And let me give you several examples. We will be providing additional guidance on determination of anticipated financial effects, climate-related scenario analysis, scope 3 measurement, identification of risks and opportunities, determination of the scope of the value chain, as I mentioned, and determination of current financial effects. In addition, because we recognize the some of the difficulties companies face initially in beginning sustainability reporting, the board has decided to delay the requirement of simultaneous publication of financial and sustainability reporting, so that companies would now have up to the end of the second quarter to provide their sustainability disclosure. We believe that it is important to provide simultaneous disclosure to provide investors sustainability and financial information at the same time, particularly with respect to things like proxy voting. We also recognize that at the beginning of this process, some companies are going to struggle with that. And so the board has made the decision to delay the simultaneous publication requirement and has provided until the end of the second quarter for companies to do that. So I hope that provides a little bit more concrete context about the kind of relief that the ISSB is trying to provide to SMEs who are starting out in disclosure.
Thank you. Very, very comprehensive and valuable. Let's move on to Development Bank's perspective. So BPI France, Christophe and Raphael, I believe you have you're going to take us through a presentation which addresses the questions of how are you estimating your own footprint from your SME financing operations, and which data are you collecting from these SME portfolio companies, noting that clearly they're going to be in a very early stage of gathering this information in the first place. And I guess, can you touch on some of the tools that you've provided to help SMEs measure and report? So over to you.
Hi. So yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present what we've been deploying over the last few years. So I don't know, Marija or Miriam, if you can share the presentation, or do you prefer that we do that?
I can try to do it.
Okay, so we can do that. So perfect. So
Do you
yeah,
see my screen?
Yes. Could you project it maybe? Anyway, so I understand we have roughly 15 minutes to present to you our approach. So we really wanted to have a very concrete, pragmatic view of what we're doing. So if you move to maybe slide 4, just to present, really our first cut at the ESG data collection for SMEs. This is something that we set up a few years ago now. The procedure was set up in 2014, and basically for any financing that are above a certain threshold, which is at 1 million euros for financing and 500,000 for innovation projects. We have an ESG questionnaire of 11 questions that is integrated within our CRM process, and that allows to survey, so to speak, SMEs on a scale from 1 to 4. So it's really again a first cut at asking ESG questions to SMEs, or to start acculturate, so to speak, the SMEs with those subjects. So it's quite simple, I would say. Not so much for for SMEs obviously, but also internally, because we also had to train our workforce, our commercial advisory, and yeah, so it's a semi-quantitative scale for those 11 questions, with explanatory pop-up windows to facilitate the input. So and it allows us to embed ESG, a first cut of ESG in our process. If we move to slide 7, next one, yeah, this one, also in financing. This is our continuum of supports for our climate offering. Not to detail everything, but just to mention that in the first phase, which is really a training phase or a discovery phase for SMEs, we had before last year climatometer, which was a first set of questions on climate, and which is progressively transformed to a climate maturity index, climate maturity index, which is right now beta tested among roughly 200 SMEs. And this questionnaire, this IMC, is actually a 30 questions, 45 minutes to 1 hour questionnaire that is really allow us to collect data on climate, on ESG, on strategy, on so really hands-on and really applicable to SMEs. And upon completion, the diagnostic is handed over to the SME. It's discussed with the management, and it opens whole sorts of products, of opportunities for the client. Most of the time, as you can see here, diagnostic on so it's not a spreadsheet. So on decarbonization actions, on waste material flux, on real estate performance, highly subsidized with the ADEME, which is the energy efficiency agency in France. So for a minimum cost for SMEs, they can have access to really efficient support and action. So this new product, the IMC, will allow us to deploy our ambitions with regard to climate. So this is more for the financing aspect of our approach. If we move back to slide 5, here I wanted to maybe highlight how we tackle the ESG data gap within the investment business of BPI France. So again, we're not so much exposed to the public stock. It's more private equity. So less smaller companies, less data. So we do have some listed stock investment, but most of it is in private equity. And here again, we have a continuum of tools and of time milestones where we collect data during the due diligence project with an ESG Invest questionnaire. Then during the investment and the holding period, we have a tool. So SVI is the investment tool used by our investors to manage the investments. So here again, we have an ESG tab that allows us to ask questions, discuss with the management on certain key areas of progress up until the exit strategy. So and every year we have an ESG campaign which is sent to our close to 1,400 participation that we have within the investment business line, and those this ESG campaign, if we move to the next slide, allows us to collect data on main ESG themes, and we have also been slowly adjusting it to the European regulation, and it's also NFRD compatible, so allows us to do our own reporting on those subjects, and so this is sample data, but it gives you a glimpse of the kind of data that we collect. It also allows us to communicate impact data. For instance, here on that would be data on jobs creation or percentage or equality aspect. So roughly a big outlook, high-level outlook of what we're doing. Am I doing the time? Yes. Then we've over the last year we've been trying to deep dive a bit in new analysis for us, and we did a pilot project in biodiversity impact of certain investments. If you move to the next slide, and so right now it's limited to our listed equity portfolio, so a rather small portion of our portfolio, but it's a new area for us, and right now most methodology are rooted for listed equity companies. We don't have much data on SMEs and private equity, but again, that's something that we're trying to develop with our shareholder CDC, which is a Caisse des Dépôts in France. So yeah, next slide also gives you another view of the things we're trying to develop here. Would be on a fund with 3 companies. That's the kind of data that we produce and start reporting actually to the regulator. So briefly an overview, and Raphael will dive more into the carbon footprinting calculations.
Yes, thank you, Christophe. So I will give you some details on the calculation of the carbon footprint of the portfolio and how do we estimate data for SMEs in this regard. To give you some context, so the project of estimating the carbon footprint of BPI France's portfolio started in 2020 and was done by a consultant, and we've internalized the process in 2021, and now we're in the 4th year of operation, and we spent a lot of time actually internalizing the methodology in order to be able to build our own sectoral proxies and actually also build our own methodology, ways of interpreting the evolutions from one year to the next, and accommodating certain specificities of our portfolio. Just one detail, one aspect that was important for the whole project is that from the outset, the idea was to do a maximalist, to have a maximalist view of the carbon footprint of the portfolio, and basically to reach the stage where we could, for each counterparty, for every company in our portfolio, have a proxy of its annual carbon emissions and of the share represented for BPI France. So just one slide of methodology. This is about as mathematical as it will get. What we're trying to reach, as I said, is for each counterparty have a measure of its emissions, of its annual CO2 emissions, multiplied by an attribution factor for BPI France to reach financed emissions by BPI France for every counterparty for every year. When the emissions are known for the counterparty in the sense of when they are disclosed, there is no issue. We try to use them and integrate it in the carbon footprint. How do we do it when the emissions are not disclosed, which is the case for most SMEs? We estimate it through sectoral proxies, and through this formula here, we attribute to the counterparty a proxy of the carbon intensity expressed in tons of CO2 per million euro of turnover that we multiply by the company's turnover. This is basically it. So what is important for us is that we do have a system that gathers quite up-to-date data of the turnover of every SMEs, and also all our financed SMEs are contractually obligated to either publish their turnover or hand it over to us. So we gather it, and in this way, when we have the sectoral proxies of carbon intensities, it's easy to compute a measure, an estimate of the annual carbon intensity of the counterparty. So I have 2 slides about the methodological details of how do we do the computation. I will skip over them for the sake of time, but I'll be happy to go into the details if you want. What do we do with this data? We do 3 types of analysis. Portfolio level analysis, company level analysis, and we diffuse the data through the in-house. So the first type of analysis is the portfolio level analysis that seeks to answer 3 set of questions. First questions, what is the intensity of the main sectors of exposure? This is the kind of visualization that you see here on the upper right corner. So here we see the main, for example, this is all fake data. I'm not at liberty to disclose the real data, but for example, you see that the main sector is relatively low emissions, but that the second sector of exposure is high emissions. So this would be a point of interest. Second question, which is distinct questions, is what are the main pockets of exposure of our portfolio? And this corresponds to this visualization here on the bottom left corner. This is a separate question because the main sectors of exposure may not be the main drivers of the overall footprint of the portfolio. And this is what we see here. We can have some sectors that are relatively low, represent a relatively low share of the exposure of the portfolio, but which represent a high share of the total emissions of the portfolio. So this is what we try to assess. And third set of questions, what drives the evolution of the total portfolio footprint? This corresponds to this visualization here that you have on the bottom left corner. this waterfall chart. And here we try to, we spent a lot of time trying to build a comparable measure year after year, and to be able to decompose the evolution of from one year to the next of the total carbon footprint between what is due to the evolution of the turnover of the companies, what is due to the increase or decrease of the carbon intensity of the individual companies, and what is due to movement in the portfolio, entrance and new entrants and exits from companies. This is what the first use, portfolio level analysis. Second use of data, company level analysis. Here, of course, it's only possible. I mean, we can say something to the for the companies when we have imputed or sectoral proxies. But what is especially interesting is when we have some disclosed data. What interests us is to compare the disclosed data to the sectoral proxies. And this is what we see here on the upper right corner for some companies. So this concerns mostly listed SMEs, but not only listed equity, but not only. Some big SMEs have disclosed the carbon data. And here we are very interested in looking at either the first case where a company here, like the company O, has an intensity that is far above the average of the sector, of the disclosed average of the sector, or we are also very interested in at the opposite case, namely, for example, here, company B, when a company has a disclosed intensity that is far below the average intensity of the sector. And for all companies, for all big companies, let's say, or important companies that disclose, we edit this kind of booklet that shows the evolution of the reported intensity, the reported carbon footprint, the comparison with the sectoral average, and also the reasons, the qualitative reasons given through some data platforms such as the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, the reasons given for the evolution of the footprint. So we are building this. It's semi-automatic at the moment. We are trying to automate it more and more, but we are basically building this platform for the progressive integration of disclosed data and the comparison with averages. Finally, third type of use, we actually so we do this analysis portfolio level and company level. We present it, but we also the data is used by various parts of the BPI France. Notably, the company level proxies are used for risk rating and stress testing. They are also used in some exploratory projects, such as the project of setting an internal carbon price. The sectoral proxies are an input in the company rating that Christophe mentioned previously. And very importantly, the fact of having been able to internalize the process of the carbon footprint has allowed us to actually to make some pedagogy and to accommodate, to acculturate the whole house of about this notion of carbon intensity, which was not known at the beginning, is now becoming a reference in the house to talk. We have developed a common language in the house to talk about carbon intensity of companies, which is a good place to start, let's say, even though it doesn't cover every use. And just to give one word, it doesn't cover every use, but we are very well aware that even this methodology, even as a first step, is not enough for two cases in particular. The first case is, as you mentioned here, as you notice here, the carbon intensity is dimensioned by the turnover of the company, and this creates an issue for either for a technological company, innovative company, or startups, which are in the early stage, where the revenues are typically very small. So for this segment of the portfolio, there have been additional initiatives to collect more precise data to basically estimate with a questionnaire the carbon intensity, but it takes approximately 1 day for each company, so we cannot do it for bigger segments of the portfolio. And second of all, we are also starting to calculate, to compute alternative measure of avoided CO2 emissions for project finance, and notably for financing of renewable energy and building renovations and equipment. That's it, basically. I'm going to stop there for the sake of time. I'll be happy to go back to give some takeaways or into the details, but let me stop here and go back to you, Rodney.
Well, thank you both for the very impressive and practical presentation. I've been getting lots of messages from colleagues already saying this is exactly what the OECD platform should be doing, which is good news. I also enjoyed the diversity that you have in various surveys and requests for information, support for audits, which is very important, and appreciated some mathematics on the way. I'll let I won't ask a follow-up question, but we'll to give us some time in the Q&A. But thank you. Next is Alexia. So EBF, as I mentioned before, represents many private banks and other lenders across Europe and the associations therein. So would you mind explaining to us a little bit about the evolving regulatory landscape and how it affects your members' SME operations, specifically financing, of course, and what the key challenges you've been experiencing and how you're implementing these reporting requirements and addressing some of the data gaps. You have the floor. Thank you, Alexia.
Thank you. I'd be super happy to. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about this very relevant topic that we have been working on now for about 2 years. If I can kindly ask, because I prepared a presentation, and we can go directly to the second slide. I think it's loading. Oh, okay. So we have had a bit of a presentation of what the EBF is, but indeed I'm a sustainable finance advisor at the European Banking Federation. We represent about 3,500 banks across Europe, and we represent basically on the most impacting topics on the sector. And one of our strategic themes is financing sustainable growth, which is the key objective of the team I work within. And of course, in this area, one of the key pillars is sustainable finance. So we engage on a regular basis with our banks, and then we turn over to policymakers and other relevant stakeholders to basically try and ensure an enabling sustainable finance framework, and more importantly, a legislative environment which fosters the banking sector's ability to support the transition of all actors in the economy.
Can you see my screen, Alexia?
I can, but it's still on the first slide.
Here, let me, do you see it now?
There it is. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So as mentioned, it's important to set a bit the background to understand the perspective of the banks we represent, because of course, the data needs that they have vis-a-vis SMEs and corporate clients more generally stem from the existing reporting requirements. As many of you already know, we have a lot of regulatory landscape in the EU with respect to sustainable finance has been growing in terms of complexity over the years, which is also a reflection, of course, of the high ambition of the EU. So these are just to name a few. You can see here that there is growing attention of the supervisors, so the European Central Bank, but also of the European Banking Authority when it comes to sustainability. And this has translated into banks focusing more closely on identifying and assessing sustainability risks in financing activities. But also a few transparency requirements have also been put in place as well. One prime example is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the center, which I will come back to afterwards, but also the Taxonomy Article 8 Delegated Act, for which financial institutions have to disclose the extent to which their activities are sustainable against the EU taxonomy criteria, and they publish this green asset ratio, or GAR, which shows basically the proportion of their portfolio which can be deemed green according to the taxonomy. But we also have the SFDR, which imposes transparency obligations for sustainable investment products. And also I placed MiFID in here, which has set a few rules on how investment advisors have to engage with clients when discussing their sustainability preferences, and also how the investment firm should determine whether a product meets that client's sustainability preferences. In the next slide, I focus a bit on how this is affecting banks, so how the regulatory, of course. So given all of these new set of rules, banks are progressively rethinking their business strategies, integrating ESG elements into the bank lending policies, as I mentioned earlier, also within their risk management practices. And this leads to an increased demand for ESG data and transition plans from their clients, because it's the only way to assess whether they are headed in the right direction. A lot of banks also have voluntary commitments to reach net zero. And another impact is possible pricing differentiation. So this could be under the form of an incentive. So for instance, mortgages can have preferential rates based on the EPC certificates of clients, or there may be differences to price the risk of costs, risk and costs. Of course, the impact on non-financial entities is different depending on the type of company. So the impact is quite strong when it comes to the high emitting clients that face a higher transition or physical risk and may be ill prepared for the transition. In these cases, there is a risk of deterioration of their creditworthiness. And then we also have the impact on SMEs, which is quite substantial. As mentioned earlier, some were saying how SMEs are still in an initial phase when it comes to integrating sustainability within their business practices. SMEs, for the most part in Europe, we see focus, of course, on financial impact of their investments rather than on the ESG impact. Subsequently, they are facing a proportionately higher effort for providing this newly required ESG data. But on the next slide, I focus a bit on what has led to the ESG data gap. Well, not what has led to, but why this gap when it comes to ESG data related to SMEs will continue in the future. A few times we've mentioned the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is a very important piece of EU legislation that has come in place. Financial institutions will be using the information stemming from this. They will also be preparers, so preparing their own transparency disclosures, but it's an important source of sustainability related information. Companies across Europe will be reporting against it, and within the European sustainability reporting standards that are being developed, they have already integrated data points that financial institutions need to comply with their own reporting obligations, including the Article 8 Delegated Act I mentioned earlier, the SFDR, as well as Pillar 3 reporting. But why will this data gap remain? The CSRD does not impose any reporting requirements on non-listed SMEs. So there is still this gap when it comes to European banks receiving the information from their SME counterparts. So in the next slide, I try to give an idea of exactly what the main challenges are when it comes to the SME ESG data gap, and what are some examples of what European banks are doing today to try to address this gap. So, of course, I was mentioning earlier that banks are integrating sustainability related considerations into their risk management process. Of course, in order to do this efficiently, they have to look at their entire portfolio, so not looking only at the larger companies that form their portfolio. A lot of EU banks have large exposure to SMEs, so they're very interested in looking at that and assessing to what extent that is taxonomy aligned. And a lot of banks will start reporting voluntarily against the Pillar 3 ITS template on the BTAR, or the Banking Book Taxonomy Alignment Ratio, which is basically reporting taxonomy alignment of the SME exposures. But also another important element is that a lot of banks are voluntarily committing to net zero through, for instance, the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So they need to take a glance at their overall picture and see where they stand in terms of reaching their targets. And to do so, of course, they need to take into consideration the SMEs. So ESG data, unfortunately, is not easily accessible. SMEs are still in a preliminary phase on reporting on or even integrating sustainability considerations into their strategies. There's a lack of a simple and common standardized template against which SMEs can report and fulfill all of these data requests that may be stemming from banks, but also the larger corporates they form a part of the value chain of. The complexity of the taxonomy, as I was mentioning, banks are looking at taxonomy alignment of their portfolio. This is already difficult to implement for larger companies. It is even more so difficult to check for taxonomy alignment with small companies. There are some criteria under the taxonomy that are particularly difficult to assess compliance with, including do no significant harm and the minimum social safeguards. So there's a lot of difficulty in the engagement with the SME clients to understand where they stand in this respect, and lack of a common methodology for proxies and estimates in the absence of SME-related data. So, however, a lot of banks are acting individually to find possible solutions. Of course, where banks stand in terms of how advanced they are in addressing this issue depends a lot on different elements. One being, for instance, whether it's a larger bank or a smaller bank, if they've started working on sustainability-related issues only a few years ago, or if they have been working on this for 10, 20 years. So of course, we see larger banks, as you could compare maybe a large company and a small company. If with more resources, they're able to invest and up the skills of their existing employees when it comes to sustainability and ESG related skills, or even hire employees with technical expertise like engineers that can help SME clients in putting together a transition plan, a credible transition plan. Although we also see that smaller banks are coming up with quite innovative solutions as well, which I'll bring up a little bit later. But what we see is, for now, there's a lot of bilateral engagement with clients. So basically, a bank will discuss with each client, SME client, and see where they stand. Of course, this is not practical, or let's say the most efficient in terms of costs, but it is a first step. And also another issue is that in the long term, it doesn't really lead to comparability amongst data that's being collected. Another first step we see is banks putting together questionnaires for their SME clients. So what we see is, for now, that they ask very basic questions if they take sustainability into consideration in their strategy, if they have a transition plan, whether they're a B Corp. And then we see, depending on the member state in question, we see that, for instance, in Italy, a lot of banks are engaging bilaterally with public entities to retrieve ESG-related information. So public bodies that already detain some useful information that can be used to understand their SME's positioning. And an example is there are public bodies that detain some detailed consumption information per type of energy source. They may have geographic specific information that help measure physical risk of an SME depending on their localization. And also they're engaging to understand which of this information that is publicly available is useful to measure taxonomy alignment. So they're in the initial phases with this, but it's an important step forward and reduces also the burden, of course, for SMEs not having to request them bilaterally, this type of information. And we also see in some of the Nordic countries, there are some banks engaging with industry specialists that play the role as a sort of mediator between the bank and the SME in question. And this is especially the case in some of the more the sectors where it's more difficult to put in practice sustainability measures. And an example can be the agricultural sector. So we see that the banks are leveraging from the expertise of industry specialists to sort of see how to build transition plans for the smaller companies that may need the help, both from the financing perspective, so from the bank, but also from a more technical perspective, which is what the industry specialists can offer. And then finally, on the last slide, I tried to highlight a bit what governments and public bodies can do to help, and what we've been calling for at the EBF level. So what really is needed are practical solutions. A voluntary standard for SMEs is something that we've been working on for quite some time with EFRAG. And it needs to be a voluntary standard that allows SME clients that wish to be able to report without undue costs. So here we try to integrate the once only principle. So it should be a template that comprises every type of information that an SME can expect to be asked either by a financial institution or a larger corporate. So once they fill out said template, they won't be bothered with further information requests. It has to be practical. So in the case of information that may be readily available for the SME and brings no cost to them, for instance, their energy bills that may have information on their emissions, and be able to integrate this in an easy way. a central data register, but it could also be interconnection between existing data registers across Europe. So as I was mentioning, some public bodies already detain a lot of relevant environmental information. This would be extremely useful. Again, so banks and other interested stakeholders do not have to go to the SMEs and overburden them with information requests when it's not necessary. Possible use of proxies and estimates in order to narrow the SME data gap when the data isn't available directly from the SME. Also free to use tools, for instance, to calculate the carbon footprint of the smaller companies, but also to measure taxonomy alignment. And there's already an interesting tool that the European Investment Bank has put together, which is the Green Eligibility Checker. And it's an example of a simple to use tool where you can insert some information and they'll tell you to what extent what an activity is aligned with the taxonomy. At the moment, if I'm not mistaken, it doesn't integrate do no significant harm or minimum social safeguards, but a further step could be to think of a tool that integrates these aspects as well, to make it free of cost for an SME to measure their taxonomy alignment. And then finally, on a more general note, something that we are asking for at the EBF, and we recently published our paper, actually last Friday, on the need for a transition framework. We're basically, so up until now, we've been talking about transparency, which is very useful, and it's a first step because it gives a picture of where a company or financial institution is in that moment, but there has to be more focus also on the transition, so how to move those companies and those activities that are significantly harmful to green. So basically, in our case, we're asking the European Commission for clear guidance with intermediate performance thresholds or roadmaps that have to be aligned with science-based sectoral transition pathways. So this is where we think that the most impact can be achieved. So moving companies away from negative impact, but to do so, there need to be clear intermediate targets, and they need to be set up in a way that takes into account sectoral and geographic specificities. And then banks could use this as a very useful engagement tool to understand where their clients are and how to help them in their transition journey. But I will stop here. Hopefully I didn't go over time.
Thanks, Alexia. Very useful overview of identifying gaps and ways we might fill them, especially noting sort of resource capacities and scale being important considerations with regards to SMEs themselves. I think we also appreciated your explanation of how bank clients themselves might be impacted, and ensuring we try and find that balance between knowing enough about them to invest in them, but also not overburdening them, which brings me nicely onto Heather, actually, in terms of trying to be able to ask the same or similar questions for SMEs. So Heather, as the UK country chapter of UN convened Net Zero Banking Alliance, and the Bankers for Net Zero brings together, as we mentioned before, banks, businesses, policymakers, regulators to define and implement interventions needed to accelerate the UK's economy, in this case, to net zero. And so we've heard quite a lot about already the difficulties in obtaining data on SMEs and environmental performance and impact. So how are the banks that you work with approaching this, and what innovation solutions might you be able to bring forward to make sure that this situation is a win-win for both the banks and other lenders and SMEs? Over to you.
Thanks very much, Rodney. So yes, as introduced, the Bankers for Net Zero is the UK country chapter of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. As such, we take a very kind of focused look at the commitments that banks have made under the alliance and what that means in terms of regulation, policy implementation in the UK. And of course, as we know, SMEs is one of the most difficult kind of conundrums out there. And so starting from last year, we started a project, and really it was just a bit of a scoping exercise to see if we could answer three problems at once. The first one is the fact that the banks have a problem, and the two previous presentations are very clear on where that kind of data gap exists, and the fact that in order to really kind of move forward and to really get a clear understanding of the portfolio, we're going to need some quite granular data from SMEs. And So that was our first kind of problem statement was around, well, how do we make this easier for the banks? We know that this is going to be a potentially a very labor intensive process. And if we don't get it right, it's going to potentially involve the breakdown of relationships between banks and SMEs if there's a significant data gap between the two. The second question or problem statement that we asked ourselves was, how do we make this a solution for SMEs who also have a problem if for no other reason, by virtue of the fact that the banks have a problem and they're going to be asked for these bits of information. And then also in the UK as well, it's worth saying that our kind of local governments, both local and national governments, have a problem in terms of trying to actually reach SMEs. So as we know, they're often time poor, and this don't necessarily have a sustainability department, especially if you've got a very small team. So we did a bit of a report last year on this, looking at the landscape, and have moved into the next kind of implementation phase of a project that we hope will actually plug a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. And in particular, how do we get almost automated assurance level data from SMEs in a very easy way? And we're basically using the same principles of open banking, and the people actually, it's Icebreaker One who are implementing the project for us. They are the ones that rolled out open banking in the UK some years ago. So basically what we're looking at is a system where, first and foremost, everybody says that SMEs have nothing in common, and it's not true necessarily. They do have three things in common generally. They've got an energy supply, if not a direct relationship with an energy supplier. They do their taxes, so they've got a relationship with Revenue and Customs and the taxman, and they've all got a bank account in some way, shape, or form. Now, certainly some of them might use that via a personal bank account on the smaller side of the SME side, but ultimately everybody transacts in some way with their financial institution, and for the most part on a very regular basis. So the general question is that we ask ourselves is, so first and foremost, what's proportionate for reporting? And we will have a work stream on this. We've already started engaging with the likes of CDP and PCAF and ISP. I very much hope we'll have a conversation very shortly on this, but what at a very, very basic level is the minimum amount of information that we need to get from SMEs at the smallest level, and can we automate that as much as possible to make it a very clear, simple process for them that's just a matter of permitting the sharing of that data, very much like we have in open banking. So as I said, first and foremost, what are the very kind of basics that we need to get? And right now we're just going to focus on energy consumption, because that is obviously the starting point. The whole idea is to build some rails, and then that can scale out. So then secondly, as I said, how do we automate that as much as possible? And again, that's a whole tech process that'll be going on along the side. For the most part, the technology isn't really, as I understand it, the issue in this. It's more getting that universal buy-in. And then third, how do we, and this is the kind of interesting bit for me, how do we use the fact that people are on their bank accounts all the time as an opportunity for signposting to credible information and also inspiring behavioral change? So this is where we're working with the government, so that it's not just, obviously your financial institutions are going to be incentivizing SMEs to share information, whether that's via kind of lower rates or potentially kind of, for those happy non-borrowers, a lower cost of kind of business banking. But then taking that a step further, how do we really get them engaged? And this is where we're working with the UK government on looking at other incentives. So if we go back to that slide from the first one, we're talking about that kind of journey of SMEs, where there's that first bit of a scoping that's generally free, and then you start, as there's certain costs as you get more into the process. We're actually looking at whether or not government can step in some of those cases and provide some of those services, whether they be site surveys or whatnot, either for free or at a discounted cost for different businesses once they've engaged a certain level along the way. So to a certain extent, we're trying to use the fact that that financial institutions really have the reach to reach loads of SMEs and marry that up with government incentives to actually get engaged in the process. So this project, we are Project Perseus, and I will actually, Elliot on the call, will put a link in the chat for everybody to have a look at. But we've really just started this in terms of our steering committee. We've managed to get all the major financial institutions on board, the large accountancy firms, ledger providers. Still have a couple more firms such as Experian and Equifax to engage with, but we're very much looking at this as a whole market solution. And the tech bit of it, and this is where OECD are quite happily on our steering committee with us. Sorry about that beef, I just got distracted because I got a WhatsApp coming in there. Sorry, I just completely lost my thought there. What was I saying?
You were bringing together ledger providers and
yes,
etc.
Yeah. Apologies. And this is what the OECD have been part of the steering committee. So in terms of the tech piece that we're looking at, it's not a carbon calculator. We're not looking to replace carbon calculators. We're just looking to get some very basic assurable data at a very kind of grassroots level, as it were. Because as we know, everybody's, scope 3 is somebody's scope 1, is somebody's scope 2. And so for that information then to feed into carbon calculators, so they're relying less on estimates and industry standards and more on actual data. So it's a very, very simple piece, but the idea is that it's completely scalable. Obviously, the incentive bit that we're working with the UK government is kind of an add-on to that, but that could be replaced anywhere around the world. But the idea is very much like open banking, that we create the rails of something that is scalable, interoperable, and ultimately, in the very first instance, quite simple, and something that we can work from the bottom up. So that's really, I guess, where we are now. We would absolutely be delighted to engage with anybody on this call and the European Banking Federation, anybody else, just to discuss where other bits of work are going and where, because ultimately we're all very busy and we don't want to replicate work, but we think that there's an opportunity within this just to start gathering that data in an assurable way from the ground up.
Thanks, Heather. Very, very interesting and useful to frame the commonalities of SMEs, because you're right, they often do get discussed as being diverse and non-homogeneous, but they are all having accounts and banks, bank accounts and also energy demand. So very much agreed with there. We have 9 minutes left, so I think that's probably down to my the excitement of the speakers and trying to manage the time. But we have some questions that have gone in the chat, which I see. So thank you for that. I think let's kick off very quickly with perhaps a quick question to BPI France, which is given the diversity of finance providers is a key area to ensure that SMEs actually can access finance that best suits their needs. Can you tell us a little bit about the main data challenges that these providers, being potentially small businesses themselves, face when investing in SMEs, and what BPI France might be doing to support them? I'll give you that for 1 minute.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
So I guess if I'm reading this correctly, I think the question was that you provided a lot of information on the practical tools for SMEs. Are you also providing tools for the lenders if you don't invest directly? Do you do intermediary finance, for instance? I imagine that's where the question is coming from.
We have lending and investing are two separate things. So usually we never do solo lending. It's always blended lending. So we're never the only one lending to the company. So they're obviously for the lending part again, we have to sometimes compose with the other banks, trying not to again overburden the SME. On investment thing, we never solo invest, and we never take a major stake within companies. So because for well, for many different reasons. So yeah, no, I'm not sure. So we don't train our co-investors or co-lenders. We have already much to do with our internal workforce and the SMEs that we're accompanying in that, supporting in that area. I don't know if that answers.
I think that's useful. Thank you for also being short.
Yeah.
So I guess I have a question for Alexia and for Granville, which is quite similar in terms of, so given the sort of the potential risk of divergent approaches in terms of understanding what banks should disclose, how are you taking steps to sort of coordinate for Alexia with your members to make sure that they're all, I guess, on similar pages, not necessarily the same page? And Granville, you mentioned exploring the various alignments that you may need to do with other industry expectations. So would you mind sort of addressing the sort of divergent side of these standards, please? Alexia, you first.
You mean to avoid, just to clarify the question, you mean avoiding having diverging practices when it comes to reporting from different banks to ensure, let's say, ideally comparability? That's right, yeah. Okay. Well, we're hoping that comparability will be enhanced through the development of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and it's what we're trying to achieve also when it comes to SME reporting, which is why we are very supportive of the voluntary standard that Cluster 8, which is within the FREG organization, had worked on. Because ideally that's the end objective, being able to compare the data that's coming in. And then of course, something that wasn't mentioned so much today was also the bank's reliance on ESG rating providers. And in the EU, we're going to have an upcoming proposal for a regulation later this year. So that's also something that we try to address, because at the moment we see very different methodologies being used by different ESG rating providers, which leads to more divergence when it comes to reporting also from the financial institution perspective. So we're looking at the regulatory developments and seeing where we can try to tackle it and give constructive advice from our banks to sort of narrow this diverging tendency.
Perfect, thank you. And Granville, do you have any comments to make on this question?
Sure. Well, with respect specifically to financial institution disclosure, the ISSB has confirmed that that the S2 standard will require financed emissions disclosure for commercial banks, insurance, and asset management, and that the requirement was undertaken because of the recognition that investors need financed emissions for disclosure to accurately assess transition risk. And we believe that by requiring financed emissions in these three sectors, we're going to generate, that the ISSB will generate consistent and comparable information. Now, the financial institution requirement will require, of course, information to come from investee companies or borrowing clients, and so that will have that will require greenhouse gas disclosure information from those entities as well. And there's been a lot of discussion on the call today about different developments in the marketplace that can facilitate the disclosure and the acquisition and the disclosure of greenhouse gas information. So we are quite optimistic that the financed emissions requirement is going to provide investors information they need to judge the transition risk faced by financial institutions on the one hand, and that there are techniques and products in the market with more coming that will allow financial institutions to efficiently meet these requirements.
Thank you, Granville. Very, very useful. We have 1 minute left, everyone. I'm really apologies for that. There are also many, many questions that are in the chat. I believe Miriam will sort of explain sort of next steps there. In the interest of being fair, Heather, would you like to spend 10 seconds on what a successful 2023 looks like, and then we'll pass on to Miriam? Be a bit optimistic here, given the challenges. Oh, can you not unmute yourself?
There we go. Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. Successful 2023 for us is getting the project that we're doing piloted at a significant scale, where we can start to see some real kind of, as I say, bottom-up data coming in through and making sure that that's working and in order. Very simple.
Perfect. And Miriam, over to you. Thank you for letting me chair, and I'm looking forward to next steps. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rodney, and thanks to all of the speakers and to the participants who were very active. We had over 90 people joining the call today. The chat, the Q&A was very active. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and we might think about allowing more time for future events, but we are keeping those questions on hand so that we can follow up. And the speakers may also follow up individually, bilaterally. It was really very encouraging to see that so many different stakeholders are now looking closely at this issue, are interested in this issue. It's clear that the question of how to bridge SME data and reporting gaps is an important one that many institutions, financial institutions, organizations, and companies are grappling with. As we heard from Granville, concern about SME reporting efficiency and burden is a global concern. So that's encouraging in itself. It's going to be challenging for me to try and wrap up, so I'll just pick out a few key takeaways that I come away with from today's discussions. I think it was very important to hear from Granville how the ISSB is looking at easing the burden and allowing transition, a smooth transition for SMEs based on the principle of reasonable or supportable without undue cost or effort as a sort of a guiding principle that can help SMEs take a more realistic view of their disclosures and also allow room for improvement in reporting over time. We heard that ISSB will be helping by providing additional guidance materials to help businesses consider their own disclosures, and this is something that's very encouraging and certainly very much needed. We were able to hear the perspective from financial institutions, both public financial institutions and private ones, on how they're looking to meet their own reporting requirements without putting an undue burden on SMEs, and also by providing tools to those SMEs to help them measure or estimate their carbon footprint. An important point that we heard from several of the speakers from BPI France, but also from Alexia and EBF, that there's a question of capacity also among financial institutions, in-house capacity to become familiar with this whole new world of disclosure, and the capacity that often varies by size of the institution. So those are, we talk a lot about the constraints SMEs face, but financial institutions also have differing resources and are equipped in a differentiated way to address these requirements. So this is something that's very important. We heard from BPI France about the many different ways they're leveraging the data that they collect and estimate to make the most of the rich data sets that they've obtained. This is a work in progress. We've heard some of the limitations, but also some of the future ambitions of working with this kind of data. Another point that I took away was, clearly there are data gaps. SMEs have things in common, but they're also quite different, especially a data gap pertaining to non-listed SMEs that are sort of, for now, maybe left out of this whole process. We heard that a lot of banks are acting individually to find solutions. They're working through bilateral engagement with clients, but also through industry counterparts, looking also at sectoral engagements, all of this in the effort to limit the burden and try and find solutions. We heard from Alexia also about their interest in a voluntary standard for SMEs based on the once only principle, which is a very important principle within the EU that could be help standardize this information. And lastly, we heard, of course, from Heather about their project Perseus, looking for ways to automate and simplify SMEs data reporting to help SMEs, to help banks, and also to help governments, national and local governments, in obtaining simple grassroots data in order to rely less on estimates. So, all of these issues raise a lot of questions. There's a lot happening in this field. There are many different actors, and one of the challenges, of course, is to coordinate the various efforts across financial institutions and other stakeholders to avoid a sort of a mishmash, like a big mix and duplication of requirements. And of course, some of the principles guiding this effort should be alignment and interoperability, as we heard. There's a clear role for dialogue and consensus building around these issues, and we hope that our platform can also play a role here by convening dialogue as we've had today on these issues, by trying to understand the different approaches and map the initiatives that are out there. We've already started to work on this topic following the call at our December conference, and we'll be putting out some thoughts on this later in the year. And I just wanted to flag that we're also launching a survey of public and private financial institutions next month, which can help build the evidence base in this area and sort of map and benchmark the approaches that financial institutions are doing, the approaches they're taking and what they're doing to try and solve this very big question of data. So with that, I'd like to once again extend my thanks to everybody, Celine, Rodney, all of our invited speakers and participants, and we very much look forward to continuing the dialogue in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay.